Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is the second of a three-part series titled Indifference is Not an Option, Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, and Solidarity. My name is Dr. Michael Lovett-Collier. I serve at USD as the Assistant Vice President for Mission and Ministry. And along with my colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Burns, we're one of the co-sponsors of this series. It's really a great honor to be with you all today and to be together for this important discussion. Last week, we had wonderful presentations from Dr. Carmen Nanco Fernandez and Dr. Reimer Berry about the document, including a video from our Bishop McElroy. And we're really fortunate today to have an esteemed theologian with us today, Massimo Faggioli. My job is just to welcome you all and provide a few instructions and then introduce our moderator. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We asked during this beginning part of the event, during the talk, that you keep your camera off if you would be able to do so. That helps maximize the experience for everyone, and or you could put your Zoom on the speaker mode. At the end of the talk, there'll be time for questions and answers that we'll manage through the chat function. And at that point, we'll invite you to turn your cameras back on. So that's the housekeeping part. And now it's my honor to introduce the moderator of today's event. And that is Dr. Victor Carmona, an assistant professor here at USD in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Dr. Carmona has been here since 2017. Prior to joining our community, he taught graduate students at the Oblate School of Theology in Texas. Dr. Carmona holds a PhD in moral theology and Christian ethics from the University of Notre Dame, where he also earned a master's degree in theological studies in moral theology and Christian ethics. He earned his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, focusing on international politics, law, and organizations. Before joining the academy, Dr. Carmona served migrants and urban communities with the Mexican Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. Those experiences motivate and influence his research on immigration ethics and theologies of migration, which he pursues with a global perspective grounded in a Latinx point of view. Dr. Carmona teaches classes in Catholic theology, theological ethics, spirituality, and Latinx theology. He's a very popular and beloved professor on campus. He's known for his style of gently and wisely accompanying students while also pushing them to explore new ideas. His research interests include Catholic moral theology, Catholic social teaching, Christian ethics, liberation theology, US Hispanic Latino theology, Second Vatican Council, and immigration, among others. Dr. Carmona is a prolific writer in both scholarly and popular outlets. He had a recent piece including chapters on immigration of value and vulnerability, an interfaith dialogue on human dignity, published by the University of Notre Dame Press. He also published an article titled Conscience at the Polls, Voting, Immigration, and the Common Good in the Catholic Moral Theology website. And then perhaps most recently, he wrote a commentary for the local newspaper in town, the San Diego Union Tribune, in January titled, This is How and Why We Celebrate Three Kings Day on January 6th. So Dr. Carmona, thank you so much for being with us today and moderating today's event.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the second event of the series, Indifference is Not an Option, Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, and Solidarity. The three-part series sponsored by the Francis G. Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture and Mission and Ministry explores Pope Francis's teaching on fraternity and social friendship. Today's event is titled Fratelli Tutti in the United States. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Massimo Faggioli. So Dr. Massimo Faggioli is professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. His areas of expertise include the papacy, Vatican II, the Roman Curia, liturgical reform, New Catholic movements, and Catholicism and global politics. He is a contributing writer for Commonweal and a columnist for La Croix International. At Villanova, Dr. Faggioli teaches courses on modern church history, Catholicism, and world politics and ecclesiology at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. Dr. Faggioli's books and essays have been published in more than 10 languages. His most recent book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, presents historical and theological context for the Biden presidency and a look at the man's devout faith. Mr. Biden, who is the second Catholic president of the United States, made his Catholicism a central part of the campaign, peppering his speeches with references to his faith and quotes from Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. In 2018, Dr. Faggioli received the Catholic Press Association Award for his book, Catholicism and Citizenship, Political Cultures of the Church in the 21st Century. So welcome, Dr. Faggioli, to this virtual space of the University of San Diego. And now it's welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I still remember I have fond memories of my visit to the campus of USD. I think it was March 2013, and it's unforgettable. And I've met Jeffrey, sorry, many times. And I've heard about Victor, his work, and of USD in general. So it's a great pleasure to be with you again. It's a pleasure also because it gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I think is very important and has a specific edge, especially in this moment. I read the encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, when the idea of writing something on the election of Joe Biden came to my mind. And it became clear that there's a very particular kind of conjuncture in this moment between the papacy, this papacy, the Vatican, and the United States, both politically and ecclesially. And so I am very happy that I could give some more thoughts in these last few days to prepare these few ideas on this encyclical, which is very particular. So here, just a short introduction. So there is already in the date of the publication of the encyclical an interesting connection between this pontificate and the United States. The encyclical was published exactly 1 month before the election of November 3rd. And many observers were not sure that Pope Francis was ready to publish it before the election. So according to many, myself included, I expected that the publication would be postponed after November 3rd. Why? Because we know that whenever Pope Francis talks about globalization, economy, politics, there's something very specific that he has to say to the United States about America. And so I was surprised that the publication came before the election. And actually, the encyclical was one of those papal texts or quotations that Joe Biden decided to use in the campaign. So that was interesting to see. And so this is the first introductory remark. The second is this: is the Fratelli Tutti can be called a social encyclical. And social encyclicals are, in Pope Francis' teachings, the most particular, the most typical of his pontificate. It's a social encyclical that apparently doesn't address the ecclesial issue. So it talks about the economy, society, politics, but it doesn't talk directly about the church. But as we will see in a few minutes, there is indirectly also a certain critique of an ecclesial model, and to some extent also a certain critique of a recent American ecclesial model in some sense, not only American, but of something that we see in this country. The third and finally introductory remark is that this is an encyclical that is social, but also has a very openly stated ecumenical and interreligious goal. And so it's about picking up the thread that's typical of the whole pontificate of the theme of the one human family, of human fraternity, one human family, which is a theme of the Second Vatican Council, but in Pope Francis has gained much more traction than before. Why is this interesting about America? Because it has an ecumenical and interreligious perspective, but in a different way from what was ecumenism and interreligious dialogue in the 20th century. So in church history, in the 20th century, ecumenism and dialogue among religions is mostly a North American European affair. So the major contributions to ecumenism and interreligious dialogue at Vatican II come from Europe and from North America. And so here Pope Francis is bringing a new perspective because he's the first Pope that is non-European, non-Mediterranean. His approach to Islam is not typical of a European Catholic or of a North American Catholic. It comes from a church leader of the south of the world. This is in itself already a new approach of the papacy to North America, to the United States, from a different angle that is a bit more distant than what it was for John Paul II, especially, or for Pope Benedict. And so this is a very short introduction. Now, I have structured my remarks in two parts. In the first part, I will go through the most important passages in the encyclical where there's something that we can see speaks directly to America, to the United States, or about the United States. In all chapters, there's something like that. In the second chapter, I will try to, in the second part of my remarks, I will try to summarize. So what are the big themes of this encyclical that we can see as typical of Pope Francis' theology and worldview when he talks about the United States, he thinks about the United States, and what is this encyclical telling us about our ecclesial situation and our national, political, social situation. So here, first part, so this encyclical is divided in chapters, and every chapter has its own title and so on. I've given subtitles, I mean, my own subtitles. And so here, chapter 1, I think, could be called a criticism of, not of America, but a criticism of the American global model of economy, of commerce, of capitalism. So here, this is chapter 1 is a difficult chapter to read. It can really become depressing. If you stop at chapter 1, don't stop there, okay? So because you may have really the impression that this Pope has a very bleak picture of the world, but it's actually a very realistic analysis of our world. And so what is typical of Pope Francis' perspective here that as a message for North America. There is a very clear focus on the economic model, on a criticism of a certain ideology of the freedom of the market, and of a certain liberal economic approach, according to which the most important thing is to let the capitalistic market do its job and everything will be fine. And so this is a very harsh critique of Francis, paragraph 33, 37, for example. But there's also in this context a criticism of some cultural aspects that have become typical of modern capitalistic societies. For example, what concerns the media, for defamation and slander can become commonplace in paragraph 46. There's a devaluation of human relationship in favor of digital relationship, which is something that we know very well how it works, and it is really functional to a certain economic model also. And there's a tendency to prioritize some cultural identities and to look with contempt often to other cultural identities. And so this is chapter 1, a very bleak analysis of the situation. Now, chapter 2 is the theological engine of the encyclical. Why? Because it's basically an exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's why any criticism of the encyclical that says that it is too sociological and not theological is, in my opinion, totally meaningless. Because, I mean, chapter 2 on the Good Samaritan is the whole center of the encyclical. What is this chapter saying to North America, to the United States? There is an interesting passage on slavery, for example. So where Pope Francis asks, quote, "I sometimes wonder why it took so long for the church unequivocally to condemn slavery and various forms of violence." And so this is articulating the question that all of us have: why did it take so long? And actually why it's still taking so long for some of us. But there's one even deeper criticism that I think can be applied to our ecclesial situation, which is this. At paragraph 74, and again, it's the exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So where there's one very striking sentence of Pope Francis, paragraph 74, it shows that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we're actually living in a way pleasing to God. So this is a criticism of something Francis is very impatient for, which is religious hypocrisy. So here Pope Francis is a very patient man, and sometimes I think too much, honestly, on some issues. But he is not patient with hypocrisy in the name of religion. And so this is really typical of every religious culture where there is in public a public display of piety and of devotion, but in reality, so there's something else. Okay, so this is, I believe, it says something on us. Chapter 3, it's an analysis of the social and political situation in the global world of today. So here, I have rephrased, I mean, the title of this chapter is for a social and economic participation and against exclusion. So here the word participation is one of the key words, for example, in the documents of the Second Vatican Council and of the most important document of Vatican II for Pope Francis, which is Gaudium et Spes, on the church in the modern world. So participation is one of the core ideas that Vatican II embraces and supports, actually, because the Catholic discourse on the one human family that begins in modernity with Vatican II, it's not the old universalism, which was paternalistic, right? You do whatever we church say you should do, and everything will be fine in one human family in the world. No, Vatican II is not about that. Vatican II says we think that the quest of peoples, of women, of minorities to become active politically, socially, economically is one of the signs of our times. And so here Pope Francis speaks directly to that trajectory of the Second Vatican Council. What does it say to North America and to the United States? Many things here. So here, for example, paragraph 102, there's this very interesting comparison that he takes from the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. He said, we have turned those that live close to us, that we should see as neighbors, in something different, which is associates. What's the difference there? Is it associates means that it implies the pursuit of a particular interest, economic or political. Okay, neighbors is much more basic, is much more foundational. Your neighbors because you live together and not because you have a shared interest, right? And so this is one of the things that we see, for example, that some communities where we should treat one another as neighbors, actually we are associates or neighbor or competitors. Okay, so this is, I believe, interesting. There is another critique of the economic system, and again, there's the theme of hypocrisy. If, for example, at paragraph 110, quote, indeed, to claim economic freedom while real conditions bar many people from actual access to it, and while possibilities for employment continue to shrink, is to practice doublespeak, end quote. Okay, so again, hypocrisy is one of the things that is for Pope Francis is revealing of many mechanisms in our societies. It's very important, 120, where he says, quote, the right to private property can only be considered a secondary natural right, which is something that is very difficult to accept for capitalistic societies like in the United States, where the right to private property is often seen as the most important right. Actually, here Pope Francis is saying nothing new. It's something that is in the Catholic tradition since the Middle Ages, the 11th century, 12th century. Canon lawyers of that period already had said that the universal destination of goods for the common good is much more important than an inviolable right to private property. And so this is not new. it sounds new because in our economic system, we have given more and more emphasis to the right of private property as the most important right. And so this document is clearly something that makes clear that this is not Catholic teaching. So that you may believe that if you wish, but this is not the view of the Catholic Church on the economy and on the human person. Chapter 4, there is a discourse on what is universalism. And this is interesting because there is a passage on the fact that we should stop making distinctions between people that are part of the majority and people that are the minorities, which is something that says a lot to many countries, but also to the United States. So there's a very interesting passage on the importance of Latino culture in the United States, for example, 135. But there's an interesting passage between 142 and 145 on the necessity for a truly universal understanding of the human family. So you need both a local and a universal perspective. And so this is very interesting because he says, if you look only at your local reality, your world will become parochial. If you are interested only in the universal, because you're able to make money no matter where, in London, in New York, in Shanghai, you will become a person that is unfaithful to the vocation of the human person to be rooted in a local community with real people. And so this is interesting because we know that one of the typical dynamics of advanced capitalistic societies, especially the United States, is this gap between those who live and are somewhere in a particular place, often because they have to, because they have no other choice, and those who can make their money, who can anywhere. So it's this difference between the somewhere and the anywhere. Okay, so here Francis says we need both dimensions to appreciate the Catholic perspective on the one human family, which is both about being local and about being universal. Chapter 5, it is very directly speaking, I believe, to the United States, because it's a whole chapter on politics and on statecraft, what it means to be a state. And this is interesting because what we have seen in these last few years in theology, in Catholic theology as well, especially in this country and in the Anglosphere, is a certain, in my opinion, a dream that there can be the common good without the state, that we can take care of each other, but we need, as Catholics, to reject the authority of the state, of government. So and this is very, very interesting to see that there is still, so this vision, both on the right of the political spectrum and on the left, okay, for different reasons. Okay, so we can talk about that in the discussions if you want. Okay, so here Francis, in my opinion, and I wrote something about that, Francis is rejecting those dreams that there can be a politics at the service of the common good without government, without state. I believe this is one of the courageous teachings of Francis, because he's defending something that is unpopular these days, right? I mean, saying that you need to pay taxes because your taxes will be used for schools, for roads, and so on. It's not always popular. In some countries, much less than others. And the United States happens to be one of those countries. Okay, so here Pope Francis is defending a Catholic view of politics as something that is at the service of the common good, of the protection of the common good, of the vulnerable, of those who need to rely on healthcare and so on. And for that, you need a government, you need a state. Okay, and so this is it runs through the whole chapter, especially with a very strong criticism of the ideology of the trickle-down economics. And so this is a common theme in Francis, but in the entire Catholic tradition, in Francis, I would say even more. And so there's a criticism of the devaluation of politics. So here Francis is defending politics as a noble vocation, as something that is a Christian thing to do. And is actually, I think, encouraging more Christians to become active in that, because it is the most important way we have to remain one human family at the political level. We haven't invented another way that is better than politics at the global level. Chapter 6 says a lot about the United States, because there is, I believe, a thinly veiled criticism of the ideology of the culture wars. So there's a whole paragraph on the importance of culture. We live in cultures. I mean, nothing that we do is pure, is abstract from a context that has a history, as language, as symbols, and so on. So here Francis is basically defending a pluralistic idea of cultures in the plural, and is defending the idea that there can be and there must be a dialogue of cultures. So here again, dialogue is one of those words that sounds really 1970s for many Catholics. I mean, something that is passé, is no longer in fashion. Well, actually, for Pope Francis, dialogue is very much in fashion, is very, very, very necessary. Chapter 7, it's on conflict, justice, and reconciliation. There is, I believe, a series of passages that speak to American political culture, especially when it talks about war, militarism, death penalty. So here there is a long list of issues that he's mentioning, but there's one particular passage that I want to read. It's a paragraph 240, when he quotes John Paul II, and I quote, Saint John Paul II observed that the church that does not intend to condemn every possible form of social conflict. The church is well aware that in the course of history, conflicts of interest between different social groups inevitably arise, and that in the face of such conflicts, Christians must often take a position honestly and decisively. end quote. This is incredibly important. Why? Because Pope Francis is not saying this with so many words, but I think he's saying that for too long, Christianity and Catholicism have been identified with law and order, with just get along, don't make a fuss, don't protest, right? So here there is an acknowledgement that conflict is sometimes a necessary passage towards justice. So here Francis is not taking one particular position on the conflicts of the United States in these last few years, directly at least, but he's saying if there's conflict, it's not because there are just a few individual people that are violent, but because there's some social problem there, and the church is about taking a position on those problems, much more than saying don't protest, don't rally. Okay, so this is very important because it dismantles a certain ideology of a false sense of social peace, which is not Christian, is not Catholic, and actually that comes from John Paul II. Okay, final chapter, it's chapter 8, which is on religion and violence, and there are many chapters here that many passages that are very interesting, but there's one especially, which is this, is the emphasis on the concept of religious liberty. In this document, Pope Francis says that the Catholic Church's idea and theology of the freedom of religion is freedom of religion for every believer, for everyone. And this is what Vatican II in 1965 finally declared, especially thanks to the work of an American Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, who was the hero of the issue. Why is this relevant for the United States today? Because what we have seen in these last few years in the Catholic Church in this country is a certain attempt, sometimes unconscious, but sometimes very conscious, that to say that actually the idea of the Catholic Church on the freedom of religion is the freedom for Catholics only, which is not the theology of the Catholic Church on the freedom of religion. So here in this document, Pope Francis knows exactly that if there's something that is inevitable in the future of all churches, of all religions, is the challenge to understand how to coexist in a system of freedom of religion. In some countries, this has been experienced for a long time already, for example, the United States. And some other countries still have to get there. But here Pope Francis, I believe, once again, implicitly, is warning against those countries where the freedom of religion is an experience of decades or centuries, where some harbor dreams to go back to the old system of freedom for me, but not for you. And so this is very complicated, of course, because in this century, religious freedom means not just being able to worship freely, to build your churches, your mosque, or your synagogue. It means also bioethical issues. It is very complicated. But there's no turning back from the idea that the church is in favor of the freedom of religion, no matter your religion. To be entitled of the right of the freedom of religion, you don't need to be a Catholic, or otherwise your rights will be less, which was the old system. Okay, so this is very important any document that is addressed explicitly to the one human family, and in a special way to Muslims. This is very, very important, because we know of the conflictual history of the relations between Muslims and Christians, often exactly in the name of the issue of the freedom of religion. And so this is one important passage. Okay, so end of part one, and now part two, shorter, I'll promise. Okay, so here there are evidently a few issues on which Francis has a clear message that speak directly to the United States, on the economy, on death penalty, on war, on politics, and so on. But there are also other themes that I believe are transversal. One of these is the attention of Francis to how modern communication systems and technologies have reshaped our lives in a new ecosystem of permanent surveillance. This is a political issue, it is cultural, it's also spiritual. And so here Francis is saying, look, this is happening, and this is fragmenting the one human family. We all know the role the United States has had historically in developing new technologies, new communication technologies, and so on. And so this is important for us. Second, he talks about the temptation of our societies to sort themselves in micro communities of individuals that look the same, earn the same money more or less, think in the same way. And so it's the phenomenon of the gated communities, but it's also in the church a phenomenon of shopping for a particular parish that is tailored to your interest and so this is also an ecclesial phenomenon that is visible in this country, I would say maybe more than others, for many reasons, and we can talk about that in the debate. Third, Francis outlines an idea of the one world, the one human family, basically as a multicultural, multi-religious city. Not as a village, but as a city, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious. Here Francis is showing that it comes from a big metropolis, from Buenos Aires. There's a certain distance between his imaginary of the world and the rural imaginary, which is very important for the religious culture in the United States. Here there's a distance between how Francis talks about the world he imagines and a certain way in which many Americans imagine the city as essentially secular. And so here Francis has a different take on that. So here there's a cultural distance. Fourth, there are the three things that for Francis define the possibility of participation of individuals in society. It is family, but also work and the public space. Why is this directly talking to us in the United States? Because the United States is one of those cultures and religious cultures where apparently the discourse on family has absorbed everything at the expense of your rights and duties on the workplace and of a public space in the city, in the environment, for example. So here Francis has a very traditional view of the family, but he also says your vocation as a Catholic cannot be absorbed completely by the family only. So there's a public space there that makes the human family. So the human family is not just a collection of families. It's also something else that happens when you are not in your family. Or if you don't have a family, you are a member of the human family, and that has certain spaces and places. Finally, there's the huge shift that's happening, and it's something I wrote at length in the book on Joe Biden. It's this: Pope Francis, in his major documents, but in this one especially, is saying in a very gentle way, but also unmistakable, that the world is shifting and the international geopolitical alignments and alliances are no longer the ones of the 20th century. And this is, I believe, honestly, particularly difficult to accept for some Americans. The United States has been at the center of the world for 1 century, more or less now. I mean, after the World War I. So here, Pope Francis has a sense that the world is going to be polycentric, not dominated by one superpower. We are no longer in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was clearly one superpower. Now there is China, there's India, there's Russia, there's Brazil. I mean, it's a very complicated one human world. And so here Francis, in this document, but also in Laudato Si, other documents, he's saying basically the church is no longer strictly bound to European culture, no longer, and its political alignment is no longer necessarily with Europe and North America as it used to be because of anti-communism. And so it's a world where there are different tectonic plates that are moving. And so the Catholic Church and the papacy are studying this. And this document is very, very careful in giving us an idea of the Catholic Church that is for a global world that is no longer the one of the 20th century, no longer the one of the Cold War, not even the one of post 9/11, of the early 21st century. So now we have entered, I believe, a new phase of the 21st century. And this has implications for the United States, for US Catholicism, because we need, as a country and as a church, to find a new role, because the old one is no longer necessarily available. That is, it's in the cards. It's not about what we would like to do, but what are the real conditions. Final thing, this is a great document, even if it has flaws, a few flaws in method, I think, as I wrote in Commonwealth, because it's saying one big thing, that to save our planet and to save our countries, we need to get into to accept the idea that we need a civil or civic asceticism. We need to enter in a season of purification. And today is Ash Wednesday, so this is very appropriate. So we need to give up a few things. We need to give up a few things in the economic system, in a political system. And so it's a call not just to structural reforms in this or that, because this is not the Pope's job to call for a reform of Congress or anything like that, but he's saying we need a new civil ethics that can come from a process of purification, of asceticism, actually. And so I find this document incredibly rich for all of us in this world, but again, I think especially for us in this country and in this church. So I would stop here. I thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, or everything. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Faggioli. So let's see, everyone. At this point, then, please go ahead and write down any questions that you would like to ask to Dr. Faggioli. Please write them on chat and send them my way. That way I am able to moderate the conversation between the group and Dr. Faggioli. At this point, I already have 2 questions, so please keep the questions coming. So I will call on Dr. Emily Reimer-Berry to please ask her question. And I invite you to unmute yourself and go for it. There you go. Okay, so I will ask the question for Dr. Reimer-Berry. Oh, let's see. Can you? I think you can unmute yourself by hitting on the space bar. No. Okay.
She should be okay now. Try it one more time, Emily.
No.
No. Okay. So sorry about that. So here goes. The question was, do you interpret the Pope moving away from a just war framework, paragraphs 256 to 262? Where does that leave us in the US as a global military power? Is this a rejection of the responsibility to protect and so on?
Wow, that's a tough question. So I think Pope Francis definitely has a more radical approach to just war theory than his predecessors. No question about that. All of them, I mean, even Paul VI was very careful in not sending signals that could be distressing for Washington, so that is known. Now, I think this is much more a position of principle for him than a political position. Why? Because we all know that a more radical position on nuclear weapons, for example, on the possession and not just the use, but also possession, it would have been easier to accept in the 1990s than now, because we know that now, so this is a new age of confrontation. There's a new age of a new run to armaments. I mean, Iran and so on. And so that has accelerated in these last few years, actually, because we know that the Iran deal was signed in 2015, and it will be hard to go back to that deal of 2015 now that Iran has acquired more capabilities and so on. So it is difficult to make, so that's why I don't think Joe Biden will be inclined at all to embrace that. It's not, and there are many issues in practice, I mean, Iran, but also Taiwan and so on. So here, I believe it's not about asking this or that superpower to accept that. I believe it is part of Pope Francis liberating Catholic teaching from political concerns that for a long time have really been constraints on what the church could say. And again, in the 60s, 70s, I mean, Paul VI couldn't use, for example, the word détente. Why? Well, because Washington didn't like it. And so the Catholic Church, we're not going to use it, right? So, and so here Francis is a completely different kind of guy. And he's saying that even though we know that it's not clear if this papacy will embrace really the rejection of the just war theory that has been proposed by some Catholic groups. You know that there's been this conference in the Vatican, I think 2016,
17.
and they were pushing hard. So here Pope Francis has gone beyond on nuclear weapons, saying not just the use, but also possession. But on just war itself, there hasn't been a formal change. But you're right, this is one of the most sensitive issues, especially for the United States and for US Catholics that we know are known for a radical pacifist sensibility on the left. I mean, Dorothy Day and so on. But one of the pillars of American Catholicism is a certain constitutional militarism. We know that. And so these are two very different components. And one of them is not really happy with what Francis is saying on the issue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Reimer. Barry, let's see. Now we have a question from David. Now we do have two Davids in the room. So if the David who sent the question could please unmute themselves and ask their question.
Yes, you mentioned the Pope being from a metropolitan city, a large one. And I think you said something to the effect that there are different ways people view the city, if I understood you correctly. I'm wondering if you could speak about that.
Sure. So what I meant is this, is that especially in this last half a century, in this country, there has been a growing divide between the urban areas and the rural areas. And so that has to do with income, with access to culture and so on, but also with religion, okay? Because we know that cities are secular places. I mean, and I don't need to quote Harvey Cox here, but I mean, so one of the typical developments of the 19th, 20th century is that you go live in the city, you leave behind your tradition and your religion. So while, as we all know, in this last election, for example, many religious voters are those who still live in the rural areas. Okay, so here there is a tension between rural areas and urban areas, which is really not the same in Argentina or in Europe, for example. So so of course we know that there are still churches in the cities and so on, but ideally, in the imagination is you go to the big city, you mingle, you are attracted to other ways to enrich yourself, your personality, and so on. And so this is Francis is offering a different perspective from the North American one, I'd say.
Thank you. Let's see. Now we have a question from Gary Short. If you could please unmute yourself.
So in reading this document, I realize it's a very complex, sophisticated statement, and realize how busy the Pope is with all the footnotes And I'm imagining he must have a number of scholars and writers who help him. I'm wondering if you have any insight on the kind of people he surrounds himself to produce a document like this.
So this is a good question. I wrote about that in Commonweal a few days after the publication of the encyclical, because I actually criticized the way this document is structured, because I don't remember exactly, but I mean, more than 40% of all notes, of all footnotes, quote Pope Francis himself, which is not just a matter of taste. I mean, it's a bad taste when you always quote yourself, but it's a matter of how you present the tradition. So here there are many statements that in this document, it would have been important to say, well, actually that comes from the 12th century or the 15th century. It doesn't come from myself, okay? So here, my hunch is that in these last 2 years, more or less, so there has been a change in the drafting team around Pope Francis, and I don't know who helped him with this encyclical, but certainly that has been kind of a missed opportunity in some sense, because it is easier for some who don't like what is in this document to dismiss that, because they, well, this is what he thinks, but actually it's his opinion. Well, actually it's not his opinion, because everything has a very long history, in many cases multi-secular, right, a multi-centennial. And so that is a problem. So as you know, I mean, every pope, he doesn't write his own encyclicals by himself completely. I mean, he always has. And there could have been more care on that. And I don't know if it was maybe because he wanted to have a document that was easier to accept to Muslims. And so if you always quote from Pope Francis, they can, I mean, relate more easily than if you're quoting the popes of the 12th century or 13th century. Maybe it's that. But that is, so it's an encyclical that needs a certain kind of second layer of footnotes. That where you say, well, this is quoting something else that was a few centuries before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Now I would like to invite Emilio Chavez to ask their question. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'll try to zero in on the problem. I mean, I think that, you know, like I said, rational people can discuss all these things, but when you really want to believe something, and I know that Massimo knows about Ottaviani and the pre-Vatican period where people believed certain things, but they were still rather rational. But I think today you have people, for example, denying the COVID, denying hospital being filled up, denying the need to wear masks. I mean, it's a blind faith of a sort we haven't seen before. And my question is, how can you possibly engage these people in any kind of dialogue that's going to result in anything?
Well, if I knew that, I would be a rich man. I mean, it's very hard. It's very hard. I believe that much of it has to do with the invasive role of digital communication, which is not just having everything on your phone in your hand, which usually means the worst of the stuff, not the best. I mean, everything means the worst. So, but what that has entailed is a collapse of a certain local media system, a certain crisis of the education system, So here, I'm not against the internet. I mean, I don't want to say that at all, but certainly there has been a collapse of everything that was around it. And so that has created, I believe, an intellectual crisis in religion, in Christianity, and in Catholicism as well. So how do you engage? It is very hard, because the phenomenon of the gated communities is not just where people live existentially in a separate neighborhood and so on, but it's also mentally. I mean, it's a completely separate universe from those who vote in a way that's different from yours, and so on. And so this is a huge challenge that I have to say honestly, in these last 4 years, under President Trump, had the worst possible of examples. And my hope is that by restoring a certain healthy communication style from the first servant of the nation, there can be some kind of inversion of, but this is the most important thing, and that can happen in a classroom, in school, but as you know, even in churches, in parishes, it has become already very difficult, because you know that it's a divided congregation often, and you stay away from controversial issues, because it would need a seminar on what kind of sources should be considered reliable. I mean, and that takes a wisdom that is not about being cultured, having a PhD or all that stuff. So, but who should I listen to? I mean, this is really a matter of wisdom. It's not a matter of culture, but of wisdom. And so, I mean, infusing culture in people is much easier than restoring wisdom, because wisdom requires an existential community, a family, a neighborhood. It's so there's a book of wisdom in the scripture, as we all know, but it's not something that is available. So it's the question, probably. So yeah, I think you are very right in pointing your attention there.
Thank you. Let's see. We've got another question, and please keep the other questions coming to make sure that I can have them ready and organized and so on. We've got a question from Aaron Bishop, and Bishop asks, what do you think or hope that President Biden's legacy will be on American Catholicism?
So it's a very good question. So I think that having a Catholic as president is important, because if it happens only twice in more than 2 centuries, it's something we should pay attention to. I mean, that's so I believe this is that Joe Biden has restored already a certain dignity to the office. And as a Catholic, I think it's nice that a Catholic is doing that. I mean, I think others could have done that. A Protestant, a Mormon, an atheist, but that a Catholic is doing that can be beneficial for the Catholic Church. I don't think Joe Biden can heal the rifts and polarization within Catholicism. I think it can offer an example of leadership, that takes seriously divisions and disagreements, that is already a serious thing to do, included on life issues, to which we know is the most controversial issue on which Catholics are divided about Joe Biden. In terms of policies, he said often that the most urgent issue on the horizon, besides the pandemic, of course, is the environment. And on this, he's saying something that Francis has been saying for many years now, and that honestly, many American bishops couldn't bring themselves to say, except some examples like the Bishop of San Diego. So it's known that he's an exception, but I mean, Laudato Si and the environment are the most important issue existentially, and I believe Joe Biden can really be a spokesperson on this issue, also as a Catholic, as someone who has an understanding of things that are a bit better than just the bottom line of how much money we make or we save, and so on. And so here there is, I believe there is a global awakening on this. I'll give you one example. So, in Italy today, the new prime minister yesterday, or this morning, I don't remember, but I mean, he gave his first speech to parliament, and he's a technocrat. I mean, Mario Draghi was the head of the European Bank. I mean, not a socialist or a poet, I mean, a technocrat. But he said in Italian, and you can understand, and I'll translate, we should leave to our children un buon pianeta, non una buona moneta. A good planet, not just a good currency. If Mario Draghi, a technocrat who taught at the MIT, who served at the World Bank, chief of the Federal Bank in Italy, he says that, it means that there's something probably that is changing in other minds. So this is a sign of hope, actually.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Faggioli. Let's see, we've got another great question, this time from Margie Carroll. Margie, would you mind asking the question, unmuting yourself and asking the question?
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity for all of us to hear you. Given the wide political divisions that exist among US Catholics, including our bishops, do you envision Fratelli Tutti as being a potential instrument of national dialogue and deep listening toward greater understanding and unity in our church, or could it add to the chasms that already exist?
So I don't think the encyclical can add to the chasm that exists already, because they have sources and have roots that are much longer than this pontificate or than this document. So here, this document was published in a very particular moment in the United States, and I have to say, because of the election and because of what happened after the election in December and then January, it was a little bit forgotten because the national attention was on something else, as we all know. So here there is, I believe, time to do that, because as we know, the process of the reception of an encyclical, it takes many years, it takes time. So it could be something on which the US bishops or local bishops could invest some time. And this is something that I have to say many of those bishops have been reluctant to do, not just on this document, but also on Laudato Si, on Amoris Laetitia. So I'm not breaking news here saying that for the US Bishop, Pope Francis is a difficult pope to understand, and vice versa. And so, but somewhere this needs to begin, I think. So that's this my hope. It's a document, again, that shouldn't be seen as controversial, because it says only very few things that are new. All of that on capitalism, so it's old as capitalism, actually. Okay, so we need to de-escalate a little by saying, well, Pope Francis is this radical Jesuit from Latin America. It's much closer than we think. But this pontificate started being received in this country in 2013 in a very particular way. And that dynamic hasn't changed yet. But there's still time to change that. And I believe that it's one of those things on which the presidency of a Catholic can actually help break a certain spell around this pontificate.
Thank you.
So you're taking advantage of this last question. In one of the pieces that you wrote for Commonweal, you talk about this need for a vision for the church in the U.S., for church leaders here in the U.S. So how would you see this document inviting the U.S. bishops and other leaders within the Catholic Church? How would this document invite them to discern that vision? Like, is there some particular vision that this document you think would nourish, or do you think the document would offer a process that could get the bishops and other Catholics into that vision, into defining that vision?
So it's a difficult question. So I think that something that is important in the encyclical is that the Catholic view on society, on the economy, it's not a series of issues, and it's not about making a ranking of issues. So which one is the most important, and on that issue we will invest, and on the others, well, if there's time. No, here there is a vision that is of the church and of society and of a country that are together. So here I have to say that in these last 10 years, I was surprised that, for example, the huge investment made by the USCCB on the issue of religious liberty was articulated mostly in legal terms by lawyers, with argument coming from the US Constitution, so with very little theology and very little tradition of the church, and of an interpretation, of a theological interpretation of this moment of this country. And so here, I believe that the encyclical offers an example of the impossibility to take care of the Catholic people, of the flock, separately from having a vision of the nation, of the country, of as a whole. And so I'm concerned when there is this attempt to itemize issues that are dear to Catholics, because this is it's the best way to destroy all of those issues. So, and here you have to have one committee on that issue. Of course, you have to have that. Okay, but you have to have an ecclesial body, an ecclesial voice that speaks with one voice on. And my hope is that at the national level, there can be at some point something like a synod or a synodal experience, which is something that is the way, I believe, both for a local church, but also for a national church. And so here I've worked in these last few years with the church in Australia, and the church in Australia is going through something similar to the United States, the sex abuse crisis, racial justice, and so on. But the big difference is that the church in Australia chose a few years ago to have a national synodal process. So that gives an horizon, an expectation, a voice to all Catholics. So there's a time frame, there's a process where bishops will have the final vote, but that will only be the final moment, because in the 2 years before, 2 years, not 2 weekends, 2 years before, there is a whole national process on a range of bishops. So this is something Pope Francis is asking many churches to do in Italy last week or 2 weeks ago. And so this is something that unless and until we try that, we cannot say we tried everything.
Thank you. I also just learned that the churches in Latin America and Mexico in particular have also responded to that call by hopefully holding a synod in November that is open to lay people, which is very exciting. Let's see, as we begin wrapping up, so our final question is, is speaking of discernment, Kevin Murray, would you please go ahead and ask your question, Kevin?
Well, it was really more of an observation as I was sitting here thinking that Joe Biden isn't the only Catholic in Washington. And we have a majority of Catholics on the Supreme Court. We have Catholic leaders in both houses of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And it'd be wonderful if they could all somehow be called together to explore these issues and how we can find some basis of consensus or some underlying common goal that everyone could agree on, and then start from there.
You're right. It will not be easy, as we all know, also because the question now is not, are you a Catholic or not, but what kind of Catholic are you? Because and so this is a totally different world from John Kennedy 60 years ago. So, but this is something that, again, I think it can happen something like that. And if you try that, then it will be the responsibility of those who don't want to take that offer to say, no, I didn't think it was a good idea. But that's something that may happen. So I agree with you. And it's not about reaching consensus immediately, but it's about showing that having disagreements is not about to become a civil war. That is already very important for what we have seen in these last few months, and Catholics could have a role in that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Faggioli. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful conversation and a great set of questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Faggioli, for being such an engaging speaker, and welcome again to USD.
My pleasure. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd want to thank Massimo again. Do you have a final comment you would like to make before we depart?
Me?
You.
I hope to be back in San Diego in person soon, really, because that was one of the last conferences, AAR, November 2019. So that was one of my last trips, and I hope I will be back soon.
And we hope we'll be able to host you out here. So thank you very much to Massimo. Thank you very much to Victor for moderating for us. Just a couple announcements. This series continues next week on Wednesday, the February 24th at 12:30. We have Father Joseph Kenichi who will speak on the spiritual roots of Fratelli Tutti. And for those of you who are following us, tomorrow night at 5:30, we are having a discussion of Laudato Si with Michel Boudria, professor of environmental sciences here at the University of San Diego, will lead that discussion. So thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.